Hi, thanks for inviting me to your Whiskey and War Stories. I wanted to talk with you about a time in late 2008. You'll remember, banks were failing, housing markets were collapsing, the Great Recession had just begun. Stephen Harper's newly re-elected minority government had just introduced a fiscal update to address the economic crisis, one that pushed an austerity agenda that certainly would have made the crisis much worse for people. Of course, Jack Layton was our leader then. I'd first met Jack as an idealistic young councillor in my ward in Toronto. In fact, I volunteered on his very first campaign, 1982, I think. As NDP leader, Jack had become somewhat less interested these days in tilting at windmills and was more focused on getting tangible help for people whenever he could. Jack had shown this just a few years earlier when he made a budget deal with Paul Martin. $4.5 billion for people, housing, and the environment in exchange for allowing the Liberals to stay in power. Remember, this was a time when the sponsorship scandal raged, and the NDP, at least according to pundits, had an unprecedented opportunity for electoral gains. So here Jack was in 2008, again faced with a dilemma: continue being the real opposition to Stephen Harper, or try and make a deal with the other opposition parties, a difficult and politically risky move. Now, a majority of voters had just decided a few months earlier to support more progressive parties. So Jack took the risky path, chose to try and form a coalition government with the Liberals alongside an accord with the Bloc to support the new Liberal NDP government. Now, as things started coming together behind the scenes, I got a call. I was asked to clear my plans for the weekend and that we had a lot of work to do. A small group of staffers was pulled together from our issue management, policy, and research teams. Negotiations with the Liberals were going to start, and we had 24 hours or so to put together a costed policy proposal to give our negotiators. So we broke open previous election platforms, we looked at recent policy proposals, and we started to try and figure out what kind of help people would need through the coming economic crisis, what kind of investments our economy would need. We put together our proposal, we researched coalition governments, we proposed lists of NDP cabinet members, standing committee chairs, parliamentary secretaries. In fact, one of my biggest thrills as a staffer was through these times working on the proposals with Ed Broadbent and Alan Blakeney. It was really interesting talking to Alan, especially about housing. He talked like he'd never missed a beat on the issue. And sadly, it became clear to me New Democrats had been proposing pretty similar housing investments in every era, from Alan's work in the 70s and 80s, through these proposals to the party today. It was kind of funny, just as a little side note, one of the lines of communication that was most important at the beginning was between Ed Broadbent and Jean Chrétien. But this meant one of our main lines of communications was dependent on the ability of these two, let's say, somewhat older and technologically challenged people to operate their cell phones consistently, which wasn't always the case. It led to an anxious moment when Ed misplaced Chrétien's phone number, which was written on a piece of paper, and communications broke down until Emily Watkins stepped in and checked Ed's cell phone call logs, where the missing number, of course, had been preserved and negotiations resumed. Anyway, our little policy team was waiting anxiously to hear back from the negotiating team. We stood ready to start working on the Liberals' proposals and their counter proposals to our proposals and how we were going to find common ground. But when our negotiators came back, we learned to our pretty great surprise that Liberals had actually made no policy proposals at all. The whole negotiations in terms of policy were based on our work and the proposals from our little NDP policy team. Now, there was some back and forth in negotiations, but that policy accord that was eventually released publicly was mostly the same as what we had initially presented, right down to the formatting. So when some of us talk about how much the Liberals lack a commitment to policy or a commitment to principle, and how they focus primarily on power, it's an observation born from our direct lived experiences. Of course, what happened next wasn't pretty. Liberals collapsed under the weight of the Harper government's pushback. Stéphane Dion was tossed aside and Michael Ignatieff appointed. Liberals veered to the right, turned their back on their signed agreements with us, and instead of replacing Stephen Harper's Conservatives, they voted to prop up his government and pass their budget. For me, I believe it was a choice that weakened Ignatieff from the start. Certainly, when the next election did come around in 2011, Jack led us to unprecedented gains, 102 seats. And Jack, of course, became the leader of the official opposition. That night was a high point, I know, for me and probably for many of you as well. In between those times, Jack was diagnosed with cancer, recovered, fought the election, got sick again, and very sadly passed away. In fact, I'll never forget while I was his EA, getting a call from him as he came back from, he and Delivery were coming back from a trip down south. I stepped away from a family Christmas gathering that I was at as he informed me of his preliminary diagnosis, and we discussed how to handle his schedule over the coming weeks as he underwent further testing and started to tell people. I was devastated. Sitting back down with my extended family after that call and acting like nothing had happened, it was one of the hardest things I ever had to do. Anyway, I do often wonder what might have been if that coalition government had gone ahead. I know it wouldn't have been an NDP government, but certainly would have been light years ahead of what Stephen Harper gave us. And we would have shown Canadians that coalition government is not a dirty word, maybe even made democratic reform more acceptable to more people. Anyway, enough of the glory years. Thank you very much for the opportunity for me to relive some of mine, and I hope you enjoy all the great war stories tonight. All the best. Good night.